In the humid haze of 1868, the city of Savannah, Georgia, was a place of veiled histories and whispered sorrows, where the dead were never truly gone, only waiting beneath the winding roots of the live oaks. On a particular Sunday, they buried 12-year-old Abigail Fenn in her finest white dress, the one she had worn for her confirmation. By Tuesday, 2 fishermen swore they saw her walking by the river at dawn, the hem of that same white dress darkened with mud and water. They said she did not walk like a living girl, but like something pulled by a current no one else could see. If the secrets of the forgotten are what you seek, and this is your first time in our archive, then subscribe to our cause. There are many files to open, and the dead have so much to say. The funeral of Abigail Fenn was an affair of suffocating stillness, held on a Sunday afternoon when the heat of late summer pressed down upon Savannah like a physical weight. The ceremony took place in the graveyard of a small parish church that stood, weary and stooping, on the frayed edge of the city. Its white paint had long surrendered to the creeping humidity, peeling back to reveal the tired gray wood beneath. Great live oaks, ancient and gnarled, presided over the grounds, their branches draped with funereal curtains of Spanish moss that stirred in the otherwise breathless air. The light that filtered through this dense canopy was green and aqueous, giving the impression that the entire scene was submerged beneath some deep, stagnant water. The air was thick with the scent of damp earth, decaying magnolias, and the cloying sweetness of the lilies piled high upon the small sealed casket. From somewhere in the distance, carried on the faintest of breezes, came the low, constant murmur of the Savannah River, a sound that was the city's heartbeat and its ever-present ghost. The mourners stood in tight, somber clusters, their dark clothing absorbing the oppressive warmth. They were a study in communal grief, yet an unnatural silence held them. There was no open weeping, no shared murmurs of consolation, only the rustle of stiff fabric and the low, persistent hum of insects that thrived in the shade. It was a silence that felt curated, a shared and unspoken agreement to perform a ritual whose true meaning they all seemed to fear. At the center of this quiet tableau stood the Fenn family, a trinity of figures carved from stone. The father, a man whose work at the cotton exchange had stooped his shoulders long before this tragedy, stared at a point somewhere beyond the freshly dug earth of his daughter's grave. His eyes were vacant, his face a mask of exhausted resignation. Beside him, the mother clutched a single, perfect white rose, its petals so pale they seemed translucent. Her gaze was fixed upon the polished wood of the coffin, a look of such focused intensity, it was as if she were trying to see through it, to fix the image of her daughter in her mind one final time before surrendering her to the Georgia clay. Their son, an older brother of 16, stood slightly apart, his jaw tight, his hands clenched into fists at his sides. He watched the faces in the crowd, a flicker of something that was not sorrow, but a deep and simmering resentment in his eyes. Among the attendees was Dr. Elijah Crane, a man whose profession had made him a reluctant connoisseur of death in all its forms. He had practiced in Savannah for less than 5 years, having moved from the more rational and, to his mind, more sensible climate of Boston. He was a man of science, of observable facts and logical deductions, and he found the city's Gothic sensibilities to be a constant source of professional friction. He had attended the funeral out of a sense of duty, both to the family and to the truth, a truth he felt was being deliberately obscured. He had been the one to pronounce Abigail Fenn deceased, to sign the certificate that named drowning as the cause. And yet, standing there, listening to the drone of the cicadas and the carefully measured words of the Reverend, he could not quiet the disquiet that had taken root in his mind 3 days prior. His memory of the child's body was a clinical and haunting photograph that refused to align with the narrative being presented. He remembered being summoned to the Fenn's grand but decaying house on Bay Street. He had been led upstairs to Abigail's room, a space filled with the delicate artifacts of a young girl's life, a porcelain doll with vacant blue eyes, a collection of seashells arranged on a windowsill, a half-finished book left open on a small reading chair. The child was laid upon her bed, already dressed in the white garment she now wore in her coffin. The family had retrieved her from the river themselves, they had explained. A tragic accident, they had insisted. She had been waiting near the banks, they claimed, and must have slipped on the slick, muddy stones. The doctor had listened, his expression neutral, but his examination had immediately raised a series of troubling, unanswered questions. Drowning was a violent, desperate end, a frantic battle for air that left clear and terrible evidence upon its victims. He had seen it many times. There was the foam that often appeared on the lips, the pronounced cyanosis of the skin, the unmistakable presence of water aspirated into the lungs. Abigail's body showed none of these telltale signs. Her skin was unnervingly pale, almost luminous, but it was not the mottled blue of asphyxiation. Her lungs, when he had listened with his stethoscope, had not held the telltale gurgle of river water. There were no marks of struggle on her small frame, no scrapes or bruises from being dashed against the rocks by the river's current. She appeared, for all the world, as if she had simply lain down in the water and willed her heart to stop beating. The only anomaly his careful fingers had found was a small, faint discoloration on her left wrist, a circular mark no larger than a silver dollar, so subtle it was almost invisible against her pale skin. It was not a bruise in the conventional sense. It had none of the dark purple or angry red of a fresh contusion. It was more like a shadow beneath the skin, a cool, gray stain. He had noted it in his private ledger, a detail without context, a question without an answer. He had wanted to conduct a more thorough post-mortem examination, a proper autopsy that might provide a definitive, scientific explanation, but the father had refused, his voice uncharacteristically firm. He had said their faith did not permit such a desecration of the body. The doctor knew this to be untrue. He had treated the Fenns for minor ailments before, and knew them to be parishioners of a mainstream denomination, not a sect with such specific prohibitions. Yet, he had not pressed the issue. He was still, in many ways, an outsider in this city, and he understood that there were currents of belief and tradition that ran deeper and stronger than any medical fact he could present. He had signed the certificate, his pen hovering for a long moment over the words "cause of death," feeling the distinct and unprofessional sensation that he was participating in a lie. Now, watching the coffin being lowered into the earth, he felt that same unease return, magnified by the funereal theater around him. Why did no one else seem to question the official story? How could a child drown so peacefully, and why was the family's grief so eerily controlled, so devoid of the raw, ragged edges of true loss? It was a performance, he realized, and the entire town was his unwilling audience, all of them complicit in their silence. The core of the mystery was not just how Abigail Fenn had died, but why her community was so determined to bury the questions along with her body. The air grew heavier as Reverend Alcott stepped forward to deliver the eulogy. The Reverend was a tall, severe man, his face a landscape of sharp angles and deep-set eyes that seemed to hold a permanent shadow. His voice, when it came, was not one of comfort, but of grim authority. He spoke of the Lord's inscrutable will and the fleeting nature of life. He described Abigail as a quiet, thoughtful child, one who was perhaps too fond of wandering, too drawn to the melancholic beauty of the river. The words were meant to be a comfort, a way of framing the tragedy within the acceptable bounds of faith and fate. But to Dr. Crane, they sounded like a carefully constructed closing argument, a final sealing of the official record. The service reached its solemn conclusion. The father shoveled the first clump of damp, dark earth onto the coffin, the sound unnaturally loud in the profound quiet. The mother dropped her white rose into the grave, a final, silent farewell. One by one, the mourners followed suit, their movements stiff and ritualized. As the crowd began to disperse, drifting back toward the city like shadows detaching themselves from the deeper shade of the oaks, the doctor felt a professional obligation to speak. He approached the reverend, who was watching the gravediggers begin their work, their shovels sinking into the soil with a rhythmic, sucking sound. The doctor cleared his throat and began to voice his concerns, couching his medical observations in the most delicate and respectful language he could muster. He spoke of the lack of physical evidence consistent with drowning, of the unusual state of the body, of the small, unexplained mark on the wrist. He suggested, gently, that perhaps the sheriff should be made aware of these inconsistencies. Reverend Alcott listened without turning to face him. He simply stared into the deepening grave, his hands clasped behind his back. When the doctor had finished, a long moment of silence passed, broken only by the scrape of shovel against stone. Finally, the Reverend spoke, his voice low and devoid of warmth. He told the doctor that in Savannah, some things were better left unexamined. He said that the river had a long memory, and that it sometimes gave back things that were not meant to be returned. He turned then, and his dark eyes fixed upon the doctor with an intensity that was both chilling and absolute. He reported that the child was at peace now, and that for the good of her soul, and for the peace of the town, her name was not to be spoken aloud after the sun had set. He explained that to invoke her name in the darkness would be to call out to her, to anchor her spirit to this world when it needed to be free to move on. This was not offered as folklore or friendly advice. It was delivered as a decree, a spiritual quarantine pronounced upon the memory of Abigail Fenn. The doctor stood, speechless, recognizing the warning for what it was, a threat wrapped in the language of piety. The church, and by extension the town, had closed the case. He watched as the Reverend walked away, his dark figure disappearing among the tombstones. The last of the mourners were gone, and the heavy, humid silence of the graveyard settled in once more. Dr. Crane was alone with the gravediggers and the dead. He looked at the grave, now nearly filled, a raw scar on the green landscape. The Reverend's words echoed in his mind, a piece of local superstition that grated against his scientific reason. And yet, he could not dismiss the genuine fear he had seen in the man's eyes. It was a fear that seemed to hang over the entire city, as palpable and suffocating as the summer heat. As dusk began to bleed through the trees, casting long, distorted shadows across the grounds, the doctor turned and walked back toward the city, the sound of the distant river following him like a persistent whisper. The town of Savannah held its breath through that Sunday night, and through the long, watchful day that was Monday. Doors were bolted, and curtains were drawn. The name Abigail Fenn was swallowed by a collective act of will, erased from conversation. But silence, he knew, was not the same as peace. It was merely the pause before the storm. By Tuesday morning, that silence would be irrevocably shattered by two fishermen carrying a story of an impossible sighting, a tale of a pale girl in a white funeral dress walking along the muddy banks of the river as if she were looking for a way back home. The burial was a ceremony, but it was not a conclusion. It was merely the beginning of the town's long and terrible haunting. The uneasy quiet that had settled over Savannah after the funeral held through Monday, a day of shuttered windows and conversations that died whenever a stranger drew near. It was a collective, unspoken pact of denial, a citywide effort to forget the small white coffin and the questions it contained. But Tuesday came with the dawn, and it brought the river's secrets with it. The morning broke thick and indistinct, the air so heavy with moisture it was difficult to separate the sky from the water. A dense, pearlescent mist clung to the surface of the Savannah River, muffling all sound and blurring the line of the opposite bank into a smudge of gray and green. It was in this liminal hour, when the world was not yet fully awake, that two fishermen in a small, flat-bottomed skiff experienced something that would unravel the town's carefully woven silence. They were brothers, men who had spent their entire lives on this river, who knew its moods and its currents, as well as they knew the lines on their own hands. They were accustomed to the tricks of the morning light, to the way the fog could shape familiar things into monstrous forms. They were not men given to flights of fancy. As they poled their boat through a shallow tributary near the old cotton docks, one of them fell silent, his pole held motionless in the murky water. He pointed a trembling finger toward the bank. His brother followed his gaze, and the breath caught in his throat. There, on the muddy shoreline, was a figure. It was a young girl, no older than 12 or 13, with long, dark hair that hung limp and heavy around her shoulders. She was wearing a simple white dress, immaculately clean from the waist up, but its hem was dark and sodden, caked with the thick, black mud of the riverbank. She was walking slowly, with a strange, deliberate gait, her bare feet leaving small, perfect prints in the silt. Her head was bowed, her face obscured by her hair, and she seemed to be paying no attention to the world around her, lost in some private, silent procession. The fisherman watched, frozen. The sight was profoundly wrong. No child should be out at this hour, in such a place, dressed in what looked for all the world like a burial shroud. There was no sound but the gentle lapping of the water against their boat and the distant cry of a marsh bird. The girl did not seem to hear them. She continued her slow, inexorable walk along the water's edge, moving toward the dark, cavernous spaces beneath the docks. One of the brothers later reported that what had frightened him most was the silence. A living child, he reasoned, would have made some sound. A cough, the squelch of her feet in the mud, a sigh. But this figure was utterly, supernaturally quiet. As she passed into the deep shadows of the wharf, she seemed not to walk into the darkness, but to dissolve into it, vanishing from their sight, as if the mist itself had reclaimed her. For a long moment, the two men did not speak. They simply stared at the spot where she had been, at the small, clear footprints she had left behind. Then, without a word, they turned their boat and rowed back toward the city, their nets forgotten, their minds filled with a vision they knew no one would believe. Their first stop was the office of the town sheriff, a man named Barnes. Sheriff Barnes was a pragmatic and unimaginative man whose primary role was to maintain a semblance of order in a city built on secrets. He listened to the fisherman's frantic, overlapping account with a look of weary impatience. He was a large man, and his small office felt crowded by his presence alone. He sat behind a large oak desk, cluttered with yellowing papers, a half-empty cup of coffee cooling at his elbow. When the brothers had finished their story, he sighed, a long, drawn-out sound of practiced exasperation. He told them what they had expected to hear. He said it was the fog playing tricks on their eyes. He said it was likely one of the children from the shanties near the river, a runaway perhaps. He suggested they had been drinking. The story, he declared, was nonsense, born of tired minds and too much time spent staring into the gloom. He dismissed them with a wave of his hand, advising them to go home and speak no more of what they thought they had seen. To spread such a tale, he warned, would only cause needless distress to a grieving family. The fisherman left his office feeling foolish and angry, their genuine terror curdled by the sheriff's blunt, unyielding skepticism. They had seen what they had seen, but the law had declared it unreal. The story, however, did not die in the sheriff's office. Like the river itself, it found other channels. The fishermen spoke to their wives, who spoke to their neighbors over clotheslines and in the market. The tale flowed through the city's undercurrents of gossip, a whispered contagion that by midday had reached every corner of Savannah. It was a story that people wanted to dismiss, yet it resonated with the deep, unspoken anxieties that had lingered since Abigail Fenn's strange and quiet funeral. The official denial from the sheriff only seemed to lend the tale more power, transforming it from a mere sighting into a forbidden truth. And then came the second piece of evidence. A mother, who lived in a small house that bordered the cemetery grounds, went out to her yard to mend a fence. Her own young son was playing nearby, and as she watched him, her eyes were drawn to the muddy path that ran alongside the cemetery's low stone wall. There, pressed into the damp earth, was a single line of small, bare footprints. They were impossibly clear, each one a perfect impression of a child's foot. They led away from the cemetery, heading directly toward the river docks. The woman stared at them, a cold dread washing over her. She had been at the funeral on Sunday. She knew who was buried just beyond that wall. She knew the stories that were now whispering through the town. She quickly called her son inside and bolted the door, her heart hammering against her ribs. The footprints were real. The rumor was true. By late afternoon, the whispers had reached the ears of Dr. Elijah Crane. He was in his study, reviewing his patient notes, when his housekeeper mentioned the story she had heard at the market. At first, he dismissed it as precisely the kind of gothic nonsense he had come to expect from this city. It was predictable, he thought, that a tragic death would give rise to ghost stories. It was the natural, if irrational, response of a community trying to process its grief and fear. He tried to focus on his work, on the logical and orderly world of medicine, but the image of the fisherman's girl in her white dress kept intruding. It merged with his own clinical memory of Abigail Fenn, laid out in that same dress, her body too perfect, too unmarked for a victim of the river. The Reverend's warning echoed in his mind, his strange insistence that her name not be spoken after sundown. It had seemed like a superstitious command then, but now it felt like something more, a desperate attempt to keep a terrible secret locked away. The doctor was a man of science, and he despised ambiguity. The story of the sighting, combined with his own professional doubts, created an intellectual friction he could not ignore. He felt a growing sense of responsibility, a need to confront the spreading hysteria with cold, hard facts. There was only one fact that could definitively end the matter. The child was in her grave. All he had to do was confirm it. He waited until the sun began to dip low in the sky, casting long, orange rays through the Spanish moss. He did not want to draw attention to his task. He walked to the cemetery, his medical bag in hand, telling himself that he was merely seeking to put his own mind at ease, to quash the last remnants of doubt so that he could, in good conscience, reassure the town. The graveyard was deserted. The heat of the day was beginning to break, and a faint breeze stirred the heavy air. Crows gathered in the high branches of the oaks, their harsh calls echoing in the quiet. The doctor walked through the rows of old, tilting headstones until he reached the newest plot, the small rectangle of freshly turned earth that marked the final resting place of Abigail Fenn. The flowers left from the funeral were already wilting, their petals browning at the edges. He stood before the grave for a long time, observing. At first, everything appeared as it should. The mound of earth was undisturbed. There was no sign of tampering, no evidence of ghouls or grave robbers. He felt a sense of relief. The stories were just that, stories. He had allowed the town's superstitious atmosphere to affect his judgment. He was about to turn and leave when a small, incongruous detail caught his eye. The soil at the very center of the mound seemed looser, less compacted than the earth around the edges. He knelt, his scientific curiosity overriding the grimness of the location. He touched the soil with his fingertips. It was soft, yielding. He looked closer, his eyes tracing the contours of the grave. And then he saw it. The disturbance was not from the outside. The earth had not been dug into. It had been pushed out. Faint but unmistakable lines radiated from the center of the mound, small fissures in the packed clay, as if some pressure from beneath had caused the ground to swell and crack. He followed these lines with his gaze and saw something that made the blood run cold in his veins. On the eastern side of the mound, half hidden by a wilting pile of lilies, were several small, deep indentations in the soil. They were not footprints, they were handprints. The shape was of a small palm, the fingers digging into the earth, pressing down as if for leverage. It was the mark of someone pushing themselves up, of a small body clawing its way out from the suffocating darkness. Dr. Crane recoiled as if he had been struck. He stood up, his heart pounding, his carefully constructed wall of scientific rationalism crumbling into dust. He looked around the empty graveyard, at the gathering shadows, and felt a profound and primal fear. The sheriff was wrong. The fishermen were not liars. The footprints by the cemetery wall were not a coincidence. Something had crawled out of this grave. The question that seized his mind was no longer a matter of superstition or folklore. It was a terrifying, biological impossibility that demanded an answer. Was Abigail Fenn alive, or had something else, something wearing her face and her white dress, emerged from the Georgia soil to walk the misty banks of the river? He knew then that he could not rest. His quiet, orderly world had been breached, and he was now standing on the edge of an abyss. His private inquiry had just begun, and he knew, with a certainty that chilled him to the bone, that the next step had to be a visit to the house on Bay Street, to a family that was burying a secret far deeper and darker than their own daughter. The discovery at the grave had fractured Dr. Crane's world, replacing the firm bedrock of science with a chasm of terrifying possibility. He left the cemetery as dusk bled into true night, the familiar streets of Savannah now seeming alien and menacing. The gas lamps cast long, wavering shadows that played tricks on the eye, and every rustle of a palmetto leaf sounded like the whisper of a name he had been warned not to speak. He did not go home. His logical mind, though shaken, was already working, formulating a new line of inquiry. The supernatural was a realm of chaos, but human secrets, he knew, often had a tangible history. He needed records, documents, a thread of verifiable fact to follow through this labyrinth of fear. His first destination was not the Fenn's house, but the city archives, a dusty, neglected repository of births, deaths, and forgotten histories housed in the basement of the municipal building. He gained entry with a curt explanation to the night watchman that he was consulting public health records, a plausible excuse that masked the true, frantic nature of his search. The air in the archive was cool and dry, thick with the scent of decaying paper and aging leather. He lit a single oil lamp, its small flame pushing back a circle of the oppressive darkness, and began his work. He pulled the heavy ledger containing the public records for the past 2 decades. His hands, usually so steady during delicate medical procedures, felt clumsy and thick as he turned the brittle, yellowed pages. He found the Fenn family registry easily enough. He scanned the entries, his finger tracing the elegant, looping script of the city clerk. There was the record of the older brother's birth, 16 years prior. And there, dated 12 years ago, was the entry he was looking for, Abigail Fenn. His eyes were about to move on when a small, almost imperceptible detail caught his attention. Beside Abigail's name was a faint, spidery notation, a mark made in a different ink, as if added as an afterthought. It was a single, cryptic symbol, a Roman numeral 2. His heart quickened. He held the lamp closer, the light glinting off the faded ink. A 2. Why would there be a 2? He turned the page, his movements now urgent. He scanned the adjacent entries, the death records for that same week, and there he found it. Annabelle Fenn died at birth. Date of death, the same day as Abigail's birth. The cause was listed as failure to thrive, a tragically common entry in the ledgers of the 19th century. The doctor stared at the two names, Abigail and Annabelle, and a terrible, chilling synthesis began to form in his mind. Abigail Fenn was not an only daughter. She was a twin whose existence had been completely and deliberately erased from the family's narrative. No one in town spoke of another Fenn daughter. He had certainly never been told. The family had presented themselves as having only 2 children. The silence surrounding Abigail's death was not new. It was an extension of a silence that had been maintained for 12 long years. The secret was not what had happened at the river. The secret had been born with the children. The archive had given him a fact, but a fact that only deepened the mystery. Armed with this new and disturbing knowledge, he knew he could no longer delay a confrontation with the family. He left the archives and walked the quiet, moonlit blocks to Bay Street. The Fenn residence was a large, imposing house, but like so many in Savannah, it showed signs of a slow, graceful decay. Paint peeled from the ornate porch columns, and the garden was overgrown, its once manicured hedges now sprawling and wild. A single light burned in a downstairs window, a pale, lonely beacon in the dark facade. The doctor's knock echoed unnaturally in the stillness of the night. After a long moment, the door opened a few inches, and the father's face appeared in the narrow gap. His eyes, hollowed out by grief and something more, widened slightly in recognition, then narrowed with suspicion. The doctor stated his purpose directly, his voice calm and professional, betraying none of the turmoil within him. He said new information had come to light regarding Abigail's death, and he needed to ask the family a few more questions. He did not wait for an invitation, but pushed the door gently open and stepped inside, forcing the father to retreat into the dimly lit foyer. The house was suffocatingly quiet. The air inside was stale and heavy, thick with the scent of dust and something else, something vaguely medicinal and unpleasant. The mother appeared at the end of the hall, a black shawl pulled tightly around her shoulders. She looked older, more fragile than she had at the funeral just 2 days before. Her face was a pale oval in the gloom. The doctor did not waste time with pleasantries. He looked from the father to the mother, his gaze steady and unwavering. He asked them about Annabelle. The name fell into the silence of the house like a stone into a deep well. For a moment, there was no reaction. Then, the mother's hand went to her mouth, and a small, choked sound escaped her lips. The father's face hardened into a mask of grim resignation. The secret they had guarded for so long had finally been unearthed. The father led him not into the parlor, but up the grand, creaking staircase, toward the private spaces of the house. He guided the doctor to the attic, a place of stored memories and discarded things. The air beneath the eaves was hot and still, filled with the ghostly shapes of furniture draped in white cloths. In the center of the room, beneath a single, grime-covered circular window, sat a small, locked trunk. It was made of dark, heavy wood, bound with iron straps. The father produced a key and opened it. The doctor peered inside, and his breath caught in his throat. The trunk was filled with the relics of a second childhood, a life lived entirely in shadow. There were small, identical dresses, a set of worn wooden blocks, and a porcelain doll that was a perfect twin to the one he had seen in Abigail's room, though its painted smile was chipped and faded. Beneath these items was a collection of drawings, rendered in charcoal on rough paper. They were the work of a child, but they were possessed of a strange, unsettling maturity. He picked one up. It depicted two young girls with identical faces and long, dark hair. They were holding hands and standing beneath the surface of a river, their white dresses billowing around them like seaweed. Fish swam through their hair, and their eyes were wide open, staring up toward a sun they could not reach. He shuffled through the other drawings. Each one repeated the same themes: two girls, always identical, and the constant, overwhelming presence of water. Two girls in a boat on a dark river. Two girls lying at the bottom of a well. And in the corner of each drawing, the same small, neat signature, A.F. It could have been Abigail, or it could have been Annabelle. It was the mother who finally broke the silence. Her voice was a dry, rustling whisper, the sound of words that had been held back for too long. She confessed everything, the story tumbling out in a torrent of grief and fear. She told him that from a very young age, the girls had been inseparable, not just in body, but in mind. They developed a private language, a series of clicks and gestures that no one else could understand. They often claimed, in the simple, matter-of-fact way of children, that they did not know where one of them ended and the other began. The mother said they spoke of sharing dreams, of waking up with each other's memories. Then came the most disturbing part of her confession. She said the girls often claimed to switch places. One would wake up and insist she was the other, and she would know things that only her sister was supposed to know. The family had at first dismissed it as a childhood game, a fantasy born of their intense bond. But the game had become more and more convincing, more and more unsettling. They consulted a doctor who spoke of shared delusions, of a morbid sympathy that sometimes occurred in twins. He had advised them to separate the girls as much as possible, to encourage their individual identities. But the girls had resisted, becoming withdrawn and sullen whenever they were apart. The mother's confession then turned to the day of the drowning. Her voice dropped even lower, becoming almost inaudible. She said it was Abigail who had been found by the river. It was Abigail's body the doctor had examined. But she was no longer certain it was Abigail who had died. In the hours before she had gone to the river, she had been quiet, different. She had insisted her name was Annabelle. She had told her mother that Abigail was waiting for her in the water, that they were going to switch places one last time. The mother had thought it was just another one of their strange games. She had not believed her. Now, she was tormented by the question. Was it her living daughter who had walked into the river, or was it the ghost of the child she had lost at birth, coming back to claim the life it had been denied? The doctor listened, a cold dread seeping into him. The clinical case file of Abigail Fenn's death had transformed into a gothic tale of two sisters, one living and one dead, locked in a terrifying spiritual struggle. The drawings, the mother's confession, the disturbed grave, the sighting by the river, all of it was beginning to coalesce into a single, horrifying narrative. He looked at the drawing in his hand, the one of the two girls beneath the water. Was this a child's fantasy, or was it a portrait of a reality no one had been willing to see? The question that now drove him was no longer just about who had died. It was about who, or what, had been buried in that small coffin. He knew there was only one way to find the answer. He would have to go back to the cemetery. He would have to open the grave. The mother's confession left Dr. Crane in a state of profound intellectual shock. The world of measurable, observable phenomena on which he had built his life and career had been irrevocably breached. He left the house on Bay Street, the images from the attic, the twin dolls, the drawings of the girls submerged in water seared into his memory. The question of identity, of who had truly died, had become a terrifyingly literal one. He knew that any hope of a rational explanation, however faint, now lay buried 6 feet beneath the damp Georgia soil. An exhumation was a drastic, almost unthinkable act, a violation of the dead, and a deep transgression against the social and religious customs of Savannah. But the mystery of Abigail Fenn had grown far beyond the bounds of custom. It had become a cancerous growth on the A&D. Its removal, he believed, was necessary for the sanity of the town, and for his own. He did not approach the sheriff. He knew Sheriff Barnes would dismiss his request as the ravings of a madman, fueled by local gossip. Nor did he consult the church. Reverend Alcott's earlier warning had made it clear that the ecclesiastical authorities preferred this particular secret to remain buried. The doctor would have to act alone, under the cover of darkness. He enlisted the help of 2 men he trusted, grave diggers he had come to know through his professional dealings. They were stout, taciturn men, whose daily commerce with death had left them largely immune to the superstitions that gripped the rest of the city. He paid them handsomely in gold coin, a sum that ensured their silence and their labor. He explained the necessity of the task in the simplest, most clinical terms he could manage. He told them there were inconsistencies in the record of the child's death, and that a final examination of the body was required to settle the matter for the good of all. He did not mention twins, or drawings, or stories of girls who switched places in their dreams. He gave them just enough of the truth to secure their assistance, while keeping the horrifying core of it for himself. They met at the cemetery gates an hour after midnight. A sliver of a moon hung in the sky, offering little light, which suited their purpose. The air was thick and still, the only sounds the chirping of crickets and the distant, mournful whistle of a train. They moved through the tilting monuments like specters, their lanterns casting long, dancing shadows that seemed to mock the solemnity of their task. The grave of Abigail Fenn was a dark, raw wound on the landscape. The men set down their lanterns, the yellow light creating a small, intimate circle of illumination in the vast darkness, and began to dig. The shovels sank into the soft, yielding earth with a grim, sucking sound. The work was hard and slow. The soil was heavy with clay and moisture, and the humid night air made every movement an effort. The doctor did not participate in the physical labor. He stood at the edge of the growing pit, his medical bag at his feet, and watched. He was the director of this grim theater, and his role was to observe, to analyze, to be the steady eye of reason in a storm of the macabre. But as the hole deepened, and the scent of freshly turned earth grew stronger, even his scientific detachment began to fray. He found himself listening to the silence between the sounds of the digging, half expecting to hear a child's whisper on the night air. After what felt like an eternity, one of the shovels struck wood. The sound was a dull, hollow thud that seemed to vibrate through the very ground beneath their feet. The diggers exchanged a look, their faces grim in the flickering lantern light. They cleared the remaining earth from the lid of the small coffin with their hands, their movements now more careful, more reverent. The polished wood was streaked with mud, but otherwise intact. Using thick ropes, the 3 of them strained to lift the casket from the grave and place it on the damp grass beside the hole. For a long moment, no one moved. The reality of what they were about to do settled upon them. They were about to look upon the face of the dead, to disturb a peace that was meant to be eternal. The doctor took a deep breath, steadying himself. He produced a crowbar from his bag and, with a series of sharp, protesting creaks, pried open the sealed lid. The lanterns were brought closer. Their light spilled into the satin-lined interior of the coffin, and the 3 men fell back as one, a collective gasp escaping their lips. The doctor felt his carefully maintained composure shatter. What lay inside was not just a violation of natural law, it was a perversion of reality itself. The coffin was not empty, nor did it contain the single, small body of Abigail Fenn. Instead, it held two figures. Two identical girls, lying intertwined in the narrow space, their small bodies wrapped together in a final, inseparable embrace. They were both dressed in identical white funeral gowns. But it was the horrifying difference between them that defied all reason. The body on the left was in a state of advanced decomposition. Its skin was discolored and sunken, its features blurred and distorted by the inexorable process of decay. It was a sight the doctor had seen many times, the sad, inevitable end of all living things. It was the other body that was impossible. The girl on the right was perfectly preserved. Her skin was pale and smooth, as if she were merely sleeping. Her dark hair fanned out on the white satin pillow, and her lips were parted slightly, holding the ghost of a breath. There was no sign of rot, no hint of decay. She was, as she had been, on the day of her burial, a perfect porcelain doll untouched by time or death. And then, in the wavering lantern light, the doctor saw the most terrifying detail of all. Her eyes, which he knew had been closed when he examined her, were now faintly, almost imperceptibly, open. They stared up into the darkness with a serene, vacant expression, as if looking at something far beyond the Georgia night sky. The gravediggers, hardened as they were paralyzed by the sight. One of them began to mutter a prayer, his voice a low, trembling drone. The other simply stared, his mouth agape, his face a mask of horrified disbelief. The doctor, however, forced himself to move closer. His scientific training, the core of his identity, surged to the forefront, a desperate anchor in a sea of madness. He had to understand. He reached a trembling hand into the coffin, his fingers brushing against the cold, smooth skin of the preserved child. The flesh was cool, but it was not the rigid, unyielding cold of a corpse. It felt supple, almost lifelike. He examined her wrist, the one that had borne the faint, shadowy mark. The mark was gone. There was only perfect, unblemished skin. He then turned his attention to the other body, the one that was decaying. With a deep sense of dread, he gently moved the tattered fabric of its sleeve. And there, on the decomposing wrist, was the small circular gray stain he remembered so clearly. The mark had transferred. The implications of this discovery crashed down upon him with the force of a physical blow. The body he had examined, the one he had pronounced dead, was the one that was now rotting. The other, the one that had supposedly died at birth 12 years ago, was the one that lay pristine and untouched. It was as if death itself had become confused, taking one sister's life but leaving her body intact, while claiming the other's body but leaving her life force to linger. Or perhaps, he thought, a more terrifying possibility. Perhaps the two girls, one alive and one a ghost, had somehow merged in that coffin, creating a single entity that was both living and dead, both decaying and preserved. The silence of the graveyard was shattered by the sound of approaching footsteps and the bobbing light of another lantern. It was Reverend Alcott. He stood at the edge of the scene, his face a grim mask of fury and fear. Someone must have seen them and alerted him. He took in the scene at a glance, the open grave, the open coffin, the three men frozen in attitudes of horror. His eyes, however, were fixed on the doctor. When he spoke, his voice was not the measured tone of a clergyman, but the harsh, commanding bark of a man trying to contain a disaster. He told the doctor that he had meddled with things that were not meant for mortal men. He ordered him to close the coffin, to rebury it at once, and to destroy any notes he had taken. The church, he declared, would handle the matter from here. It was an order, not a request. He pointed to the parish record book he held in his hand. He said he had already checked. There was only one burial entry for that plot. There was only one death certificate. As far as God and the law were concerned, only Abigail Fenn lay in that grave. To speak of two bodies, to speak of this abomination, would be to invite a panic and a fear that would poison the entire city. The doctor looked from the Reverend's stern face to the impossible tableau in the coffin. He knew the Reverend was not just trying to prevent a panic. He was trying to suppress a truth that threatened the very foundations of his faith. A truth that suggested that the lines between life and death, between one soul and another, were not as clear as his sermons proclaimed. But Dr. Crane could not unsee what he had seen. He could not bury this knowledge, no matter what the cost. He refused the Reverend's command. He told him that the truth, no matter how monstrous, must be brought to light. The confrontation between faith and science, between a man who sought to conceal and a man who sought to reveal, had reached its breaking point over the open grave of a girl who was not one, but two. The doctor knew his investigation was not over. It had simply moved into a new and more dangerous phase. He now had to follow the trail of the impossible girl, the one who walked by the river, the one who, according to the whispers of children, could be heard humming a strange hymn from just beneath the water's surface. The confrontation in the graveyard ended in a tense and silent stalemate. Reverend Alcott, seeing the unyielding resolve in Dr. Crane's eyes, did not press the issue with further threats. He simply watched, his face a mask of grim resignation, as the doctor and his men carefully closed the coffin and lowered it back into the earth. The secret, for now, was reinterred, but it was not resolved. For the doctor, the night's horrific discovery had transformed his investigation from a professional inquiry into a personal obsession. He had looked into that coffin and seen a truth that defied every law of nature and medicine he held sacred. He now understood that the answer to this mystery would not be found in medical texts or city archives. The answer lay with the river. In the days that followed, Dr. Crane became a spectral figure in his own life. His medical practice was neglected, his patients seen by a junior colleague. He spent his hours in the city's taverns and on its docks, not drinking, but listening. He spoke to the fishermen, the sailors, the dockhands, anyone whose life was entwined with the constant murky flow of the Savannah River. He was searching for patterns, for other sightings, for any scrap of information that might help him understand the impossible thing he had witnessed. The whispers he had once dismissed as folklore now became his primary source of data. He learned that the sighting by the two brothers was not an isolated incident. An old woman who gathered herbs by the marsh claimed to have seen a pale girl in a white dress picking water lilies at dusk. A group of children who played near an abandoned rice mill swore they had heard a young girl's voice singing a strange wordless melody that seemed to come from the water itself. They called her the river nymph, a local ghost story they invoked to frighten one another. They said she only appeared on Tuesdays, and that she hummed a hymn that sounded like church music played underwater. This detail, the specificity of Tuesday, struck the doctor as significant. It was on a Tuesday that the fisherman had seen her. It was as if the girl, or whatever she was bound to a weekly cycle, a ritual of reappearance. He felt he was on the verge of a breakthrough, moving from the realm of random hauntings to something with a discernible, if inexplicable, logic. He decided he would keep his own vigil. On the following Tuesday, as evening began to settle over the city, he made his way to the riverbank, to the very spot where the children claimed to hear the singing. It was a desolate, lonely place, a small, muddy inlet, overgrown with cypress trees, whose gnarled roots, known as knees, protruded from the water like the bones of drowned giants. The air was heavy and still, the water a flat, metallic sheet reflecting the bruised purples and oranges of the setting Sunday. The city felt miles away, its sounds muffled by the dense foliage. Here, there was only the low drone of insects and the occasional, mournful cry of a night heron. The doctor sat on a fallen log, his medical bag beside him, and waited. The light faded from the sky, and the world dissolved into shades of gray and black. The moon had not yet risen, and the darkness was absolute, a thick, palpable presence that seemed to press in on him from all sides. He was a man of science, accustomed to the bright, sterile light of the operating theater. This primordial darkness was an alien environment, and despite his rational mind, he felt a primal unease stirring within him. He thought of the two bodies in the coffin, one decaying, one pristine, and wondered what monstrous fusion of life and death he was waiting for. Hours passed. The night grew cooler. A faint mist began to rise from the river, swirling in ghostly tendrils around the cypress knees. The doctor was beginning to think his vigil was in vain, that the children's stories were nothing more than fantasy, when he heard it. It was faint at first, so subtle he was not sure if he was imagining it. It was a sound that was both a note and a feeling, a low, resonant hum that seemed to vibrate in the air, in the ground, in the very marrow of his bones. He strained his ears, holding his breath. It grew louder, clearer, resolving itself into a distinct melody. It was a simple, haunting tune, a wordless hymn that rose and fell with the gentle rhythm of the river's current. It was unmistakably the voice of a young girl, but it had a strange, ethereal quality, an echo as if it were being sung in a vast, empty chamber, and it was coming from the water. He stood up, his heart pounding, and crept closer to the river's edge. The humming grew louder, seeming to emanate from the very center of the inlet. He peered into the darkness, his eyes struggling to penetrate the thick gloom and the swirling mist, and then he saw a change in the water. The surface, which had been as black and still as glass, began to shimmer. A faint, silvery light appeared beneath the water, a pale, phosphorescent glow that pulsed in time with the humming. The light grew brighter, and the water began to churn, not violently, but with a slow, deliberate rolling motion, as if something large were surfacing from the depths. The doctor watched, mesmerized, a part of his mind trying to find a scientific explanation: swamp gas, bioluminescent algae, while another, more dominant part knew he was witnessing a miracle, or an abomination. The figure broke the surface. It was the girl. She rose from the water, not like a swimmer, but like something being lifted from below. She stood upon the surface of the river, her white dress clinging to her small frame, its hem swirling in the glowing water around her feet. Her long, dark hair was wet and streamed down her back like Spanish moss, dripping silvery droplets that sparked with the same pale light. Her face was turned away from him, looking out at the main channel of the river. The humming stopped. The silence that fell was more profound, more terrifying than the sound it replaced. The doctor found his voice, though it came out as a dry, cracked whisper. He called her name, Abigail. The figure on the water turned her head slowly, her movements unnaturally fluid, like a plant turning toward the Sunday. In the faint, otherworldly light that radiated from her, he could see her face. It was the face of Abigail Fenn, the same pale, heart-shaped face he remembered from his examination, but the expression in her eyes was something he had never seen on a human being. It was an ancient, empty sorrow. She opened her mouth to speak, and the doctor braced himself. But the voice that emerged was not one, but two. It was a horrifying, discordant sound, a duet of dissonant voices speaking the same words in perfect, terrible unison. One voice was small and frightened, the voice of a lost child. It pleaded with him. It said he should not have come. The other voice was cold and hateful, a guttural whisper that seemed to come from a place of deep and unending rage. It told him he had seen too much. The two voices, the pleading and the hateful, wrapped around each other, creating a sound that was a violation of all natural harmony. The girl, this impossible creature of light and water and memory, took a single step toward him, her bare foot gliding over the surface of the river. He saw two reflections in the water beneath her. One was the girl herself, and the other was a dark, distorted shadow, the image of a decaying corpse. He understood then that he was not seeing a ghost. He was seeing a soul that had been torn in two, a life and a death bound together in a single, tormented vessel. The pleading voice begged him for help. The hateful voice promised him a grave in the cold, dark mud of the river. The doctor, for the first time in his life, turned and fled. He ran from the river, from the singing, from the girl who was 2 in 1, his scientific mind shattered, his soul touched by a horror for which there was no name. He stumbled through the darkness, the sound of the two voices following him, a hymn of sorrow and a promise of death that would echo in his nightmares for the rest of his days. He had to warn the family, to tell them what their daughter had become. But when he finally reached the house on Bay Street, he found it dark and empty, the windows like vacant eyes, and every mirror within its walls covered by a black cloth, as if the family had finally understood they were living with something whose reflection they dared not see. The final, definitive account of the Abigail Fenn case does not come from the official records of Savannah, nor from the hushed and fearful gossip that eventually faded into legend. It survives in a single, remarkable document, the private journal of Dr. Elijah Crane. After his terrifying encounter at the river, the doctor did not remain in the city for long. The house on Bay Street remained empty, its inhabitants having vanished as completely as if the river mist had swallowed them whole. The doctor found himself a man adrift, haunted by a truth he could neither share nor forget. His scientific certainties were gone, replaced by the chilling memory of the two voices, the pleading and the hateful, that emanated from a single, impossible child. The city he had once seen as a place of charming, if irrational, superstition now felt like a crypt, a place where the dead did not rest easy and the living kept their secrets locked behind shuttered windows. He understood that he could no longer practice medicine in a place where the fundamental laws of life and death had been so monstrously inverted. Within a fortnight of his vigil, he sold his practice, packed his belongings, and left Savannah, seeking the cold, hard rationality of the North as if it were a sanctuary. His journal, discovered years later among the effects of a distant relative in Boston, becomes the final, epistolary chapter of this haunting. The entries from his last days in Savannah are written in a script that grows increasingly agitated, the once neat, clinical handwriting becoming a frantic, almost illegible scrawl. These last pages are not the dispassionate observations of a physician. They are the desperate testimony of a man who has witnessed an event that has permanently fractured his perception of reality. He dedicated his final entry to a complete and meticulous record of the Fenn case, as if committing the story to paper was a final act of exorcism, a way to purge the horror from his mind by giving it a tangible, textual form. He begins with his initial examination of Abigail's body, noting with renewed emphasis the lack of any physical sign of drowning and the strange, shadowy mark upon her wrist. He recounts the unnatural silence of the funeral, the Reverend's cryptic warning, and the fisherman's sighting, all the pieces of the puzzle that had at first seemed disconnected. He details his discovery in the city archives, the revelation of the buried twin, Annabelle, a fact that became the key to the entire grotesque mystery. He describes the mother's confession in the dusty attic, her words painting a portrait of two children so psychically intertwined they believed they could exchange their very identities. The emotional and narrative climax of his account is, of course, the exhumation. He describes the scene in the graveyard with a harrowing clarity, the memory clearly seared into his mind. He writes of the impossible sight within the coffin, the two girls, one decaying, one perfectly preserved. He details the horrifying discovery of the mark, which had seemingly migrated from the preserved body to the decomposing one, a physical manifestation of the spiritual exchange the mother had described. It was, he theorized in a margin note, as if the life force of Annabelle, the twin who had died at birth, had clung to Abigail in a parasitic bond. Upon Abigail's death, this spectral twin, this ghost that had lived in her sister's shadow, had somehow seized control of the physical form, arresting its decay, while the true, deceased soul of Abigail was forced to inhabit the decaying vessel that should have been her sister's. It was a mad, desperate theory, one that had no place in any medical textbook, but it was the only explanation his shattered reason could construct. His description of the apparition at the river is the journal's most chilling passage. He recounts the unearthly humming, the pale light rising from the depths, and the girl who stood upon the water's surface. He writes that as she spoke with her two terrible voices, he saw not only her reflection in the water but also the faint, shimmering outline of a second girl standing beside her, a ghostly, translucent figure that mirrored her every move. He became convinced that he was witnessing a soul quite literally at war with itself, the gentle spirit of Abigail trapped in a horrifying symbiosis with the vengeful, possessive ghost of her sister, Annabelle. His final notes from Savannah are fragmented and paranoid. He describes seeing reflections that were not his own in the windows of his study, as he wrote, a faint, smiling girl in a white dress looking back at him from the darkness. He writes of hearing a child's humming on the edge of sleep, the same sorrowful hymn that had risen from the river. He understood that Reverend Alcott's order to seal the cemetery and never speak the girl's name was not about protecting the town from a story. It was about protecting it from a presence, a lingering entity that was now irrevocably tied to the waters of the Savannah River. He concludes his account with a final, haunting addendum. He writes that he has ordered the cemetery plot of the Fenn family to be sealed under a layer of granite, a desperate and likely futile attempt to ensure that what was buried would remain so. He left Savannah immediately after. He never returned. The record ends there, the final page blotted with what could be ink or a tear. But the story itself did not end. The Fenn family was never seen again. Their house on Bay Street was eventually sold, its contents auctioned off to strangers. Yet, the legend of the girl by the river persisted. For years, even decades, after Dr. Crane's departure, sailors and fishermen would report hearing a child's song on misty Tuesday mornings, a strange, beautiful hymn that seemed to come from just beneath the water's surface. They said that on those days, the river ran with a peculiar, milky white color just before dawn. The story became a cautionary tale told to children, a piece of Savannah's Gothic tapestry, the historical truth of the two sisters, and the horrified doctor long forgotten, smoothed over by the softer, more palatable contours of folklore. The question of what Dr. Crane truly witnessed on that night remains unanswered, suspended forever in the amber of his written account. Did he witness a resurrection, the miraculous return of a dead child? Or was it a possession, the hostile takeover of one soul by another? Or, as the last vestiges of his scientific mind might have argued, did the weight of grief, superstition, and a series of tragic coincidences simply conspire to drive a good man to the brink of madness? The record offers no final conclusion. It stands only as a testament to a mystery that dissolved the boundaries between the living and the dead. The case file on Abigail Fenn is now closed. The doctor's journal, the only true record of what transpired, rests in our archive, its fading ink a permanent reminder that the past is not always what it seems, and that some secrets, like the river itself, run deeper and darker than we can ever truly comprehend. The hymn, they say, can still be heard by those who know how to listen, a final, sorrowful echo of a girl who was buried on Sunday but was seen by the river on Tuesday, still searching for the sister she could not live, or die, without. The case file on Abigail Fenn is now closed. Subscribe to the Blasphemy Archive to stand among those present when the next is opened, and leave your thoughts on what you have witnessed.